Okay, thank you.
Good morning and happy Sabbath, everybody. I pray that you've had a good week and it's a blessing to be able to fellowship with you all today. Um, Before we open in prayer, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Curtis, as Russell indicated. I live in the UK at the moment. I'm from Zimbabwe, so I've met some of you before. But it's a pleasure to get the opportunity to meet more of you, even if it's only through Zoom. Um, let's open with a word of prayer. Dear God, we all humbly come before you this morning to thank you for your grace, your mercy, and the everlasting gospel that you keep on unfolding to us. I thank you for the opportunity that we have as a group now to study, to learn, and to grow and develop in our understanding of the great controversy and our understanding of you and our understanding of ourselves. It's my privilege to be able to present, and I pray that I may do that work graciously. Um, I pray that the blessings that you have for us, we may be able to receive in full measure. This is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. So today we have two studies. Um, they'll be connected but different. One will build off the other. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or just speak up as we go along. As I try to go through different thoughts, I hope that we're able to do so in a way that makes sense and a way that each and every one of us are able to follow. So please don't be shy. Don't feel afraid to ask a question. It's my desire that each of us learn something in this experience. And I know from sitting on the opposite end how intimidating it can be to just ask a question. And so I'm hoping that you don't feel that pressure and you do in fact ask where something doesn't make sense. So this study is developed off the back of some thoughts that were shared by Elder Parmenda in Switzerland. I'm hoping by now you all might have had the opportunity to watch those studies, but if not, then that's okay. We can go through it together. The whole purpose of, I guess, what we're all aiming to achieve, myself, the various other teachers, yourselves, is to understand the Sunday law specifically. I'm sure most of a working understanding or appreciation of the fact that we are living in the time period of the Sunday law. There may be some differences about when that began, but it's our duty to unpackage the components that make up the Sunday law, not just the when. For me, the fundamental question is the why, the how, the 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 components that go into that. And so today, at least from my perspective, I won't be going into the when. It's more about trying to unpackage different elements about what makes the image of the beast the image of the beast, what makes the Sunday law period, and all those different thoughts. But if you do have questions about my position about the win and other things that we don't speak about, then I think there's a Q&A that we will have at the end, so you can share those questions then. But essentially, in Switzerland, about 3 weeks ago, we started exploring the tension between two models in the Bible, two models of the King of the North. One found in Revelation 17 and one found in Revelation 13. In Revelation 13, we have this description from verse 1 to 10 of one beast, and then verses 11 to the end of the chapter about another. And that chapter is broken up into these two phases because John wants to make a point. John wants to demonstrate something about the image of the beast, the last king of the north that's going to usher in God's second advent. But to do that, John needs to give some explanatory thought, an introductory idea to help understand that second half. So in Revelation 13, when we read those verses, in fact, let's go there. So we all have a working understanding or working knowledge of what we're talking about. So Revelation 13 verses 1. It's talking about this beast that's coming out of the sea. And John is going to describe the various characteristics about this beast, the head, the features of the name, and etc. But his description is solely about a beast. There's no indication of another entity in this story. It's just the beast. Whereas when we go to Revelation 17, there's a different aspect that's taught by John. We read about, and I apologize for the frankly sexist language that's used to describe this relationship, but it describes this harlot, this woman that's riding a beast. Um, and here you have two entities. So John is going to distinguish between the two descriptions of what's going on in different ways because John wants to make a different point in each of those chapters. If you recall, we toyed with the idea that in Revelation 13, this beast has church and state fused into one body. It's two separate elements coming together, but you don't see two separate elements. You see one. And so you just see a beast. But there's an ideology associated with that beast, indicative by the fact that this beast has something written on its forehead, um, which is demonstrating that there's an ideology that is driving this beast. When we get to Revelation 17, it's more clearly separable. You see this church, this woman that's sitting on a beast, and this church also has something inscribed in its forehead, pointing to the two ideologies that you see in the different chapters, but described in different ways. We see the similar dynamic in Daniel 2. In Daniel 2, that image starts off with a head of gold. Nebuchadnezzar is described that he's the king and he's representative of Babylon. But in that entity of Babylon, in Daniel 2, there's both a political arm, so the king, the politics that are going to run the kingdom, and there's the church, because Nebuchadnezzar wasn't just head of the state, he was head of the church as well. And so the ideology that's going to drive the state are one. The state is God, and God is the state. They're fused, they're inseparable. It's one entity. By the time you get to the feet and the toes, you see two different elements. You see the iron and you see the clay. The clay that we recognize is corrupted. It's miry clay. So you get to, I'm just going to call it papal Rome. And now there's two elements, two entities, a church and a state. They're separated. You can see them as two separate things. Whereas in Babylon, you can't distinguish between the two. They're fused into one. So Revelation 13 is going to describe what we see in Babylon as just calling it the beast. but this beast has an ideology associated with it, which is the state element that we discuss in Revelation 17. So when we think about church plus state, what we're alluding to and what we're referring to is something specific that each of those parties represent. So we have the state and we have the church. The state is your coercive power, your civil authority, your legislative force, your politics, if I can put it that way, your political arm. It doesn't originate any ideology. It just enforces it. It just does the will of the ideology. If we can think of the nature of humanity, you have two elements. You have the inner being and then you have the outer being. The outer being is your body. You can think of the state as a body. When we get to the church, as we all appreciate, it's not fundamentally solely related to the physical church building or the institution of the church. There's something associated with that institution, with that clergy, with that denomination. It's a worldview. It's a moral authority that's going to guide the state, that's going to tell the state what to do, what to think, how to enforce this thing. So the church you can think of as my poor attempt at drawing a brain. It's going to tell the state, this is what I want you to do. It's a moral ideology that's rooted in some worldview, a specific way of thinking of how a kingdom should be run. In prophecy, this, in inverted commas, woman that we see in Revelation 17 is going to reflect this ideology, this spiritual authority in that context. It's not just about the physical church that the papacy had or the papacy had as a denomination or an institution. It's specific to their ideology that they maintained throughout that 1260. So when we get to this church plus state relationship, it's the state using its power to enforce the ideological worldview of the church. And this becomes important to clearly define as we shift away from seeing that in certain circumstances, it may not be a church that's doing this. It could be something else. And so it's important to zone in on the fact that this church, when we say church plus state, is really an ideology. It's a worldview. So it could be enforcing, the state could be enforcing Sunday laws, it could be enforcing other moral legislation, it could be enforcing the idea of what the state should be. And so the core dynamic is functional. How these two entities are going to function as one. Going back to Daniel 2, when we read about that clay, the feet of iron and clay, the iron that we see in the legs is pagan Rome. It's the state arm of that relationship. And then in Daniel 2, verse 43, as we go along, I'll pop quotes or verses in the chat just so that you have context as to where and what I'm reading. In Daniel 2, it's Daniel is going to describe this vision to Nebuchadnezzar, and he's going to go through the fact that the feet and the toes are made up of clay and iron. It's a divided kingdom. It's going to have two entities. But he's specifically going to point out that this iron is mixed with miry clay. It's a specific type of clay. So when we think of clay in the context of Bible prophecy, God is going to describe Israel as their church, as their clay that God is going to mold. So your clay is symbolic of your church when molded by God. But then in Psalms 40, verse 2, David is going, I think it's David, at least. Um, David is going to describe that the fact that God brought them out of a horrible pit, out of miry clay, and set my feet on a rock. So this miry clay is going to represent your spiritual ruin, your danger, your instability that this author is being brought out of. It's corrupt, it's wicked, and you see this theme throughout the Bible. It's not just clay, it's miry clay. So this miry clay that's mixed with iron is a corrupted church, and we're all familiar with that. I'm just reminding us of stuff that we should all be familiar with as we go along in our journey. So pagan Rome is going to mix with a corrupted church, and that's what's going to form this church-state union. In the time of the apostles, after Jesus has ascended to heaven, Paul is going to be raised up and he's going to start describing the environment that he's in. In talking to the Thessalonians, he points out that there's something insidious going on. There's the church is losing its identity as the mystery of iniquity is already working. Second Thessalonians in chapter 2, around there. And he's going to point out that there's going to come a time when the thing that's restraining this mystery of iniquity from exalting itself is going to be taken out of the way. To Paul, this mystery of iniquity is developing as he's looking around. This specific worldview or ideological system is forming because this church is now becoming corrupted with the way it sees its job function, with the way it sees how it's meant to interact with the world. So the church that the state is supporting, the point that I'm trying to drive home is that it's not solely related to an institution. It's a particular worldview that the state is supporting. So by the time you come to the papacy and the 1260, the state, the kings of Europe are going to be driven by an ideology, a specific worldview. Um, in Revelation 17, verse 8, describing this woman that's riding the beast, we read about the phases in which this beast goes through, the different time periods that John is going to see. John is standing in 1798, and he's going to get explained to him the story about this beast. And it's broken up into three segments, three periods in history. He's told that the beast that you saw, that was, if you're following along with me in verse 8, the beast that thou sawest was. So in the past, it existed, is not. So in the present, in 1798 onwards, it's dead because it's not alive. And then future, it's going to ascend, it's going to resurrect out of the bottomless pit. And he's going to point out that there's three phases that this beast has. What is the thing that we associate or understand about resurrection? Because when a body dies or an entity dies, it it goes into the grave, but when it comes up, there's something specific that happens to this entity. It could be a person. In this case, we're talking about a system, a beast. And so in First Corinthians, we're told what happens when you die and you're resurrected. First Corinthians 15, verse 43. In describing this process of going from a sinner to a saint, Paul is going to frame it in that context. But the principle we can take can be applicable to this idea of death and resurrection in whatever form. And so the point that Paul is going to make when talking to the Corinthians is that you, the sinner, you end up dying in dishonor, you're sown in dishonor, and you get raised in glory. You're resurrected in a more glorious manifestation of who you were. And so this resurrection results in increased strength and increased impact. You're more able to do your work as a resurrected, more glorious person, being. So in prophecy, when we talk about this resurrection of this entity that died, that was, is not, and shall ascend, we can think of it in the context of a glorious resurrection, which means that it's now more powerful. So when it ascends, when it is resurrected, it's going to be more powerful. It's going to be more refined. So it's better able to do its job function. And all the other things that we can associate with being better than what you went into the grave with. The point is that this person, you, the sinner who has died, you had ambitions in life. Then God is going to give you a new heart in that process. And in that new heart experience, you're going to die and you're going to come up and you're better able to accomplish your goals. So if we take that to the beast, okay. Um, so yeah, when this fifth kingdom and this beast more specifically dies, it's going to stay in the grave. And once it resurrects, it's going to come back better able to accomplish the goals that it had before because it's going to have a more glorious body. And this is where we get the imagery of the beast in Revelation 13. It's no longer divided, it's together as one. So we have to ask ourselves the question, why is the resurrected beast, or in what way is the resurrected beast more glorious in Revelation 17? What does it mean for it to be more glorious or better able to accomplish its goals? So prior to 1798, if we have these three periods in history, 1798, and then at some point we'll just put resurrected. The beast is going to go down into the grave and is going to come up in a more glorious form. So prior to 1798, with the papacy, we see this mixture of church and iron. They're distinct entities, and that's what makes them unstable. That's what makes this union unstable. That's what Daniel told us when describing this mixture of iron and clay. Because the ideology is controlling the state, but they're not fully fused. That's why the union could be broken so easily. That's why Napoleon could say, I'm no longer supporting you, Mr. Church, because I don't want to do that work anymore. In fact, I'm going to come and kill you. And so they separate, and it's easy to do that because they're separate entities. And in doing their work in that 1260, as soon as one of the kings says, I don't want to do this work anymore, the church no longer has a state to do its work. So you can see how fragile this relationship is. Whereas in Revelation 13, with this parallel to the head of gold in Daniel 2, Daniel is going to describe to Nebuchadnezzar that you Nebuchadnezzar, are this head of gold. This isn't just saying that Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom is fabulous and it's a rich, illustrious kingdom. Daniel is telling Nebuchadnezzar that you and what you represent are the head, meaning your rule the feet and the toes. There's no division. The two are in sync. They're inseparable. They go hand in hand. There's no division between your religion and your state, your ideology and your state. And so when Nebuchadnezzar sets up this image in the plains of Dura and he's demanding all this worship that comes to him, he's saying that I, your political ruler, am telling you to worship me and my ideology that I have. Government policy and spiritual obligation are not distinguishable. They fit into one style of working. Going back to Revelation 13, just like Nebuchadnezzar, the beast isn't being ridden by an ideology, it is the ideology. So the power and the worldview are embodied in single political religious forces. I'm just repeating the same thing over and over again in different ways so that when we start exploring other concepts, at least for me, it makes sense why we are exploring other concepts. So I'll pause here and ask, does that make sense? This distinguish between two entities that come together and one entity that forms the basis of the job for those two entities. This distinction between Revelation 17 and Revelation 13. Are we on the same page? Okay. I'll take your silence as yes. So now when we get to Revelation 13, I said that those first 10 verses serve as an introductory thought to try and explain something about beast number 2, verses 11 onwards, the dragon, the image of the beast, however you want to frame it. And the point is that this beast that comes up, the image of the beast, is going to be a beast system that's not ridden. It's self-contained. The state and the ideology are one flesh. In previous presentations, in previous studies, Elder Tess and Elder Terry have described this union as state nationalism. In other words, culture and state coming together, or maybe what we could think of as nationalism and state. So it could be church, a state, which is specifically religious. It could be framed as culture plus state, or if we start going into the realm of nationalism, nationalism plus state. This is what we had in the 1260. These two entities. It dies and it comes back more glorious. So let's start considering what this more glorious form looks like in present day context, the coming together in one flesh. So we said that the clay in general in the Bible is pure. That's how we understand it. And your miry clay is your corrupted church. Your pure church and your corrupted church. But it's still a church in Daniel. So as we review our history, As we review the past Sunday laws that point us to our Sunday law, how should we consider them? How should we think about them? So the first one we'll consider is 1888, the 1888 history. History. Let's start there. We'll do both 1850 and 1888. What's going on with America, with the USA? Is it this church-state relationship? Is it this one entity? Let's dig into the history to find out what this resurrected beast was doing so that we can understand what this resurrected beast is doing for us. Not just the laws, but let's go through that. So, this Millerite history beginning in 1798, the beast is dead, and they're expecting the rise of your seventh kingdom, your, if we can call it, the king of the north. That's what the Sunday law is. It's the seventh kingdom entering into the glorious land. And the waymark that we have in that time period of 1798 to 1863 is 1850. And we associate that with the Fugitive Slave Act. Aware of that. Ellen White and the other Millerites of the time, the Protestants and the wider community, and I think us to a degree, have framed that what was happening in 1850 around the churches defending slavery and lobbying the state to maintain slavery, to maintain this institution. But if we examine that history beyond the churches, we can all appreciate that there was something going on beyond the churches. It was an ideology that was embedded into the culture of society, into the culture of how people thought about the rights of humanity. So this Fugitive Slave Act comes in 1850 that's going to require the citizens and officials in your free states to essentially work with the slave owners and return the escaped enslaved people back to their slave owners. It denied accused fugitives of due process, and it punished whoever aided these slaves or refused to help capture them. That's what it was. But this wasn't just pro-slavery legislation in and of itself. It was mandated national ideology. So this kingdom, this nation or this state, the specific way of thinking about who was and who wasn't a citizen, who was granted human rights and who wasn't. And it's all embedded into those early documents that formed the Constitution. It was something legally enforced across all states about who the people that brought about the Fugitive Slave Act thought America was and who it was for. So, as I'm saying, from 1798 up until you get to 1850, the US Constitution originally recognized various aspects about slavery, whether it's the Three-Fifths Clause or the Fugitive Slave Clause. Slavery wasn't just about the economy of the South. It was really embedded into American identity, especially for your Southern politicians and the speckled few in the North. And so when you get to the failure of the North and the South, we need to be able to distinguish between what the failures of each of them were. When we think about preserving the Union, it wasn't just this idea of let's keep things together because we know what is right. It was preserving a system that included and depending upon slavery. And so it's this compromise that we start talking about, this compromise for nationalistic ideas. So when the North is complicit in this exchange, in this relationship with the South, many of your judges, your politicians, and your common citizens on the North side enforced this Fugitive Slave Act, not because they bought into the ideology, but because they wanted to preserve the Union. They had different ambitions to doing the right thing, to upholding human rights. It was more important for them to preserve the Union. And then when we get to the South, their sin was specifically buying into this ideology and then running it through the nation. So other reformers, the Christian reformers, because the drivers behind abolition were really Protestants coming from a moral framework. They are going to condemn the churches for their silence and their support of slavery, because your anti-abolitionists, the big voices, are going to be, again, coming from your Protestants or your apostate Protestants, if you can call it that. And they're going to critique the problem as systemic. But as I'm trying to emphasize, it's not solely a problem with the churches. It's broader than that. It's a problem with the thinking that's going into who America was and who America should be. And it's all encapsulated in manifest destiny. Taking this small bit of America that lay on the east coast of the United States and spreading it across the continent in manifesting their destiny to be who America was in their eyes. An America that had slaves, the America that enforced slavery and spread this ideology across the continent, really. So now going back to what state nationalism is when we think about the state enforcing a specific nationalist ideology, this is where we can see the state fully infused with a specific cultural worldview, not just being lobbied by the church to do something, not just being told by your apostate Protestants, I want you to go and enforce this Fugitive Slave Act. It's really broader than that. That makes a component of it, but more broadly, it's the state with an ideology of who America is, was, and should be to manifest their destiny. And now they're going to go about and do this work. And then you get to the Fugitive Slave Act. So 1850 gives us a precedent to understand what this resurrected beast is going to do. It's not a woman riding a beast. Instead, it's a beast embodying the ideology of the woman in one. The state isn't being ridden. It's acting out the spirit of the age, the spirit of the times, enforcing this cultural, political belief system as law. And now your dragon's going to be resurrected and it's going to function in that context of 1850. So we've said the term state nationalism a couple of times. Let's begin to break them down. And other teachers have started doing that, have started breaking down what nationalism is and describing the terms. And I just want to do the same thing so that we're on the same page when we speak about this history in the context of state nationalism, and then see how 1888 reflects the same thing. So if we have nationalism, there's something we can compare and contrast it to, which is patriotism. Just like how we have clay and miry clay, and we can compare and contrast the two, we can compare and contrast nationalism with patriotism. It's really the same dynamic. Patriotism, to describe it simply, is your love for your country, grounded in certain principles. Those principles being justice. You love that your country is just, it affords liberty to its people, equality, the various other principles that you see your nation embodying. And it could be expressed in different ways. I've just got one, two, three, four terms, but it's saying my country is grounded on these principles, and I love my country for that. But when my government sways from these principles, when it deviates from these values, I'm going to critique it. I'm going to critique the government and hold it accountable. So your patriot is going to stand up and say, I love my country enough to hold it accountable. It's your pure ideology. If you can think of it in the context of Daniel 2, it's your church, your pure church. So patriotism is a pure your pure clay, your pure ideology. Nationalism, on the other hand, that we're comparing and contrasting it with, is your loyalty directed not to principles, but to the nation itself as an entity. So it sees the nation as inherently righteous, superior, or chosen to do a specific work, like manifest destiny. The whole architecture of manifest destiny is that this state was given a specific destiny in which it needs to fulfill. It's spiritually chosen to do that work, regardless of how it goes about doing it, regardless of its actions, despite everything else, because it is blessed with this righteous decree to go about and do something. It cannot err. It cannot be fallible, if you can think of it that way. So your dissent, your critique against the government is going to be framed as treason. There's no room for constructive criticism that the patriot would give. So often we see it tied to matters of race or language or religion or territory, whatever dynamic it's going to be framed around. It's this thing that what we are worshipping cannot err. It cannot do wrong because it is blessed, it is righteous, and it has been chosen to do a specific work. So this would be your miry clay of Daniel 2. It's your corrupted ideology, where it's no longer serving the principles, but it is instead serving itself in a selfish, um, vainglorious manner. Where your patriot says, I love my country, but I'm going to hold it accountable, your nationalist would say, my country is always right, and if you question it, you're the problem. So when we consider this resurrected beast in 1850 under the Fugitive Slave Act as state nationalism, the story is a lot more complex than being the state supporting the churches, about the state um, supporting a specific worldview. Here, I think we can see a bit more clearly because of how the slavery issue is embedded into the Constitution. We can see how the two are merged, they're enmeshed. The state with a specific worldview as one, moving together in sync. So let's fast forward to 1850 and consider if we have the same dynamic or do we have a different dynamic. Again, when Adventism speaks about this history, when Ellen White speaks about this history, and A.T. Jones to a degree, who's just going to follow what Ellen White frames the great controversy around, are going to frame it all around two entities, a church and a state, one supporting the other. So it's all going to be given the veneer of religion. But I'd like to suggest that there's a lot more going on than the Blair Bill. So in 1888, we point to this bill that's going to be introduced by Senator Blair, aimed to enforce Sunday observance. And Ellen White is going to speak strongly against this in the Great Controversy, in Testimonies to Church, and various other places, as opposed to this idea of church-state union. And it's being used by Adventism till present day as the primary historical example of the Protestant ideology influencing your civil law. It's correct framing, so I don't want to say that that's wrong. But what I want to suggest is that what's often overlooked is the fact that the Blair Bill was just a symptom of a much deeper issue that's going on. So if we think about in the previous presentation, I drew the analogy of a person with a pimple on their face. So if you get a pimple on your face, that pimple is going to stay. You can pop it or you can leave it, let it go. However, you're going to deal with that pimple, you recognize that that pimple is just a symptom. It's a symptom of a problem that's deeper than just this blemish that you have on your face. There's a root problem, your health, or well, it may not be your health, whatever other thing that's causing that symptom is driving that thing to appear. So the label in the context of 1888, I'm suggesting, is a symptom. It's not the root issue. If you think of weeds in a garden, there's roots and then there's the weed itself. This is the label. It's your weed. It this, your root, is what's going to drive the label or give an environment for the label to arise. I'm not sure if many of you remember some studies that Elder Test did on a paper that was written by Jared Goldstein called How the Constitution Became Christian. I really like those studies and that article, that paper that was written, because the author points to the fact that the Blair Bill was part of a broader movement to define America's identity. And the author is going to point out that it's not just this churches coming to Congress to say, let's have a Sunday law. Instead, it was a cultural movement that, in that context, was Protestant to declare that this is who America was. And it's aimed at targeting a specific group. So it's not church and state coming together in its traditional sense of here's the state, here's the church, and the church is going to tell the state what to do. Instead, there was an underlying thinking of this is who America is, and this is who America should be, to the expense of all these other thoughts or thought leaders or ideologies that are trying to infiltrate our country. The state absorbs this religious worldview, declaring it as part of its own essence. The state itself is going to have an identity. There's other historical political things going on in 1888 that I want to suggest are proofs to show that what was going on was state nationalism. And it wasn't just about Protestantism and the churches or Sunday laws. It was about a bigger ideological movement that's seeking to define who America truly was. So in 1888, I'll go through three proofs, if I can call them that, to show that that is state nationalism. This synchronization of an ideology with the state beyond the Protestant churches saying to your Senator Blair, write a bill to say no working on Sunday. In 1888, at least from the context of Jared Goldstein, as we can remember, Protestants feared Catholic immigrants coming from Ireland and Italy because they were loyal to the Pope and not to America. Jews were seen as foreigners who threatened your Protestant morals and your economic values that America had built up over time. And so there was growing panic that these groups would, over time, erode the moral fabric of the nation. This is textbook state nationalism, where your national identity is tied to a specific worldview, and anyone outside of this worldview that you have, all these different people who have a different worldview, are seen as threats or enemies. They're a threat to the state itself and what the vision is that the state represents. So African Americans are excluded from participating after Reconstruction in this 1888 history. Your Christian identity is being proposed to the state as a weapon to push out your Catholics. And just later down the road, you have issues around imperialism and this manifest destiny beyond our borders. So this 1888 history is going to serve as the breeding ground for this imperial nation that America is going to be. In addition to this label and what's going on, was America setting itself up to be a world leader. In 1888, Congress came together and passed a resolution. It was the first International Conference of American States. First international conference. When I say American states, I'm not referring to the specific states alone in the USA, but America as a continent, North and South America. Um, so Congress are going to meet in 1888, and they want to gather all these countries together to sit together in Washington to reshape how they're going to collaborate together. So on the surface, it looks like this is globalism. This is just globalism on a minor scale in the Americas. The goal was to promote closer political cooperation between your different countries in your Western Hemisphere, so North, Central, and South America. Let's cooperate together so that we can improve our economies through trade agreements and etc. Create a so-called Pan-American Union. But the driving force behind all of this, while it sounds like a peaceful diplomatic idea, is being driven by a deeply nationalist character. Because the USA is going to call these nations together as a central civilizing force. The USA sees itself that it has specific characteristics: capitalism, democracy, Christian ethics, everything that it embodies. It sees itself as superior, the way it runs as a nation. Therefore, the USA should be a moral guide for this Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere breaks down, we suffer. So, to be great, we need to ensure that everyone else around us looks like us. And it mirrors this imperialist logic that every imperial nation has when they think we need to go and civilize the world. We need to take our ideologies abroad so they look like us. And it's going to be a big driver behind what's going to justify, if you've heard my presentations in the past about 1898, it's going to drive the Spanish American War in 1898. This soft power nationalism, if I can call it that, while not using specific arms in its foreign policy, it's going to use diplomacy and trade, but specifically to export its ideological influence. So the goal wasn't just about peace, it was about shaping other nations in the USA's image. In addition to this conference that they decided to had, there was an act that was passed. So if you think of the Blair Bill, there was another policy that was passed in October called the Scott Act. Grover Cleveland, who was president at the time, is going to sign the Scott Act into policy. And what the Scott Act was a piece of legislation that looked to prohibit Chinese labor who had left the USA on vacation to visit family for various reasons, prohibit them from coming back to the USA. These were people who had visas, who had the right to live and work in the USA, but this legislation was signed to stop them from coming back because it's going to reflect a growing sentiment of protecting American labor and culture. There was previous legislation called the Chinese Exclusion Act. that was signed in 1882, which essentially said we need to stop all these Chinese immigrants from coming to America. The Scott Act is going to be signed in 1888, which is going to extend and intensify this previous act that was created. Essentially, why they wanted to stop all these Chinese migrants from coming into the USA is because they were viewed as a threat to American values. You coming and bringing all your culture from China are diluting America's way of life. And so it's both coming from a place of racism and cultural exclusionary thought, despite the fact that all these people had lived and worked in the USA for decades, for years really, in as laborers in the gold mines. It was this idea that to be American, you can't be Chinese. So essentially, the law is reflecting this ideological worldview that embeds the state, that's embedded in state policy, in state preference. If you think about the issues that are driving the immigration policies of the current administration under Trump, it's very much can be seen in what was going on in 1888, because all these Chinese laborers that were coming in were accused of undercutting American wages. You immigrants are coming and driving down wages for everyone else because we know as American companies that you will take whatever is given to you. So we're going to offer you minimum wage. As soon as businesses start doing that and seeing these Chinese laborers as um, the easy route to not spending a lot of money, the thought was that it drives down wages for everyone else. So it's framed as protecting American workers, but only certain American workers. So it wasn't only about fair labor policy, it's about who's considered part of the nation and who wasn't. So it's fusing your national identity, race, and labor into a specific ideological standard. In 1888 as well, it was an election, which we don't speak much about when we speak about 1888. A Republican, Benjamin Harrison, is going to run against the incumbent, Grover Cleveland, who had enforced the Scott Act. And the defining issue of 1888, that presidential campaign between the two, was based on tariffs, was based on um, tariff reform. Grover Cleveland is going to stand up and he's going to advocate strongly for a reduction in protective tariffs, which compelled manufacturers to charge consumers more to make up the cost of importing material. And the other candidate is going to say, no, we need these high tariffs to protect American interests, to protect American manufacturing. The exact same sentiment that we see today. So, why all this matters? This International Conference of American States, the Scott Act, the tariff wars that are going on in 1888, is because I want to demonstrate that everything that was going on in 1888 wasn't just about the religion telling the state what to do. It was actively constructing, the state, was actively constructing and enforcing a national identity that's based on these various elements that we've spoken about. I've touched on 1898 a bit as, in my perspective, and I guess historians are going to give you the same perspective, that this was a turning year, a turning point in America's rise. So we've spoken about 1850, we've spoken about 1888, and I want to speak about the year 1898. In 1898, America is going to become the world superpower that we have today after the outbreak of a war with Spain, over Cuba is going to become an imperial force as it goes about establishing colonies in the former Spanish colonies in the Philippines and in Cuba itself and other nations. I won't go over the history as a whole. If you have the opportunity to read about the history or watch a presentation that I've done, then great. But my point is that there's all these things going on in 1898. Now, I want to read a bit about what A.T. Jones has said in that history. So he wrote in the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald in 1898 an article called The Necessity of Imperialism. He's going to describe what's going on when America is going about its imperial march. Um, I will post it in the chat. I won't read all of it. I'll paraphrase some of the sections. Just give me a moment. Um, okay, I won't be able to paste all of it, but for reference, you can look it up in your devices. So A.T. Jones is going to talk about Abraham Lincoln and how Abraham Lincoln described slavery. Abraham Lincoln is going to describe slavery as being fundamentally in tension with the principles that are given in the Declaration of Independence. And A.T. Jones is going to say this description of how slavery and the Declaration of Independence were in tension, he's going to say this is exactly describes this new American policy of imperialism, what was going on with Spain and the Philippines and its colonial pursuits in 1898. Reading from that bottom paragraph. This is also, this imperialism, this is also causing many to criticize the Declaration of Independence. Leading men, leading papers of the country, who would naturally be thought ready to keep silent when the Declaration speaks, actually criticize it and, in fact, repudiate it. So, in order to justify the imperial march that America was on, they had to criticize the Declaration of Independence. They had to critique it and say, that's not really what it's about. That's not really what we stand for as a nation. But we want to uphold imperialism. So we're going to turn our backs on all those things that you're saying the Declaration of Independence supports. And in succeeding paragraphs, he's going to describe how the slavery question and the idea of imperialism are really two sides of the same coin. They fit like a glove. And in both cases, they are against what was declared by the founding, what I call founding fathers. I posted the last paragraph because I want to read that in full. A.T. Jones says the following. Remember, writing in 1898 and describing the imperialism that's going on. He says, 13 years ago, it was published that the United States would yet repudiate every principle of a republican government. If we are not just now in the time when this thing is being done, how much further will things have to be carried in this direction before we shall be in the time of the doing of that thing? So he's saying that he's looking around and he's seeing America become an imperial power. And he's looked back at Ellen White's writings and said, hey, everything that Ellen White said is happening. 13 years ago was um, brings us to a quote in Testimonies 32, page 207, paragraph 1, that Ellen White wrote um, in describing the Republican government. So she writes this in 1885. I'll post this one in the chat as well. And she writes in describing the Sunday law as how she saw it. By the decree enforcing the institution of the papacy in violation of the law of God, the nation is going to disconnect themselves from the righteous ideals that they had when they were born, essentially. And when this threefold union comes along, um, when the Protestants stretch their hand over the Gulf, etc., the Roman power is going to reach over across the abyss with the spiritualism, etc., etc. He says, our country, the USA, shall repudiate every principle of its constitution as a Protestant and Republican government and make provisions for the context of the Sunday law. So A.T. Jones is going to read this in 1898, and he's going to say, hold on, this imperial nation that we see exhibiting itself is doing the very thing that Ellen White said in 1885, repudiating every principles of its constitution. So imperialism in 1898 equals Sunday law in A.T. Jones's eyes. It has the characteristics of this breaking down of the principles of its constitution. So going back to state nationalism, we've intertwined our study with definitions of the various components of state nationalism. When we think of state nationalism, a nation could reflect a group of people who share a common identity. It could be people who share a specific culture, language, ethnicity, religion, etc., etc. But it's essentially a collective of people or tribes or whatever with the desire of self-governance or autonomy. A nation now is not the same as a state, which is a political or legal entity with borders. A nation can exist without a state, without a recognized state. So the Kurds, for instance, would be considered a nation. The Palestinians who are crying to be recognized as a state are a nation without state arms, in the eyes of the world at least. Some states, like the UK, have nations within them. So the different cultural groups that come together and serve under the state. The state can support a given nation. So crudely, it would be the state giving its support to a specific nation within that state. That nation has an ideology, a way of thinking, and the state is going to support that. But to be more specific of what we talk about when we say state nationalism, I gave three histories to demonstrate what I think state nationalism looks like when it manifests. It's this worship of the state itself. The allegiance is given to the state rather than a specific ethnic or cultural group. So the two are very similar because the cultural group can define what the state looks like. But I want to suggest that it's in the state in and of itself where this ideological worldview is brought about. So the focus is on loyalty to the nation and its greatness. In A.T. Jones's case, he views this imperial empire as the state and loyalty to the state above all. To him, the behavior in 1898 embodies what we've gone on and on and on about state nationalism, fulfilling the characteristics of the Sunday law. this resurrected, more glorious beast. There's other places, I'll just give it, which you can read in your own time. There was a scholar in the time period of early Adventism. Um, their name was Percy Tilson, not Milson, Tilson McGann. They set up a lot of the sanitary institutions and schools and etc. in the time period of the late 1800s and 1900s. Um, but they played a big part in Seventh-day Adventist education. They wrote a book called The Peril of the Republic. Um, Not Republic, Republic of the USA. And in chapter 7, for you to read about, they're going to talk about American imperialism. They're going to talk about this history of 1898 that we've described. And the author is going to point out that everything that's going on has the characteristics of a Sunday law without it being about Sunday law. They don't say the words Sunday law, but they're talking about how that 1898 history is repudiating the principles found in the Declaration of Independence, in the Constitution, and everything, which Ellen White describes, as we read in 1885, as being the marker for when the seventh kingdom essentially resurrects. So we'll close now. But what I want to conclude with is the fact that when we consider this resurrected beast, the seventh kingdom, because that's what this resurrected beast is, and try to identify who is who and what the issue is in the Sunday law period, we have a state entity, which has three branches of government: the executive, judicial, and legislative branches. All these branches are controlled by a king, if we can call the Republican Party. They're all controlled by an ideology, if you will, MAGA. So your ideology, make America great again. Your state has a nationalist view of what the state needs to be on the global scale, is going to be infused with this way of thinking, where Trump is both a god and a king, just like Nebuchadnezzar was to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar is your king of Babylon, but he's also the god that is going to call for worship when he creates that image in the plains of Jura, which is different to the union of church plus state. Church plus state, two entities where one is supporting the other. In this resurrected form, state nationalism, the two are asynchronous. They come together as one. So when we think about the current term that we're in Donald Trump's second term, and the various things that he invokes, whether he's talking about manifest destiny, which he's done on a number of occasions, or inadvertently shining light on the Monroe Doctrine, it's all to justify the state's behavior. The state has a specific vision of who America is, who the USA is with regards to the rest of the world, the prime country that deserves all the worship because of who they are. That's what MAGA is. Make America the greatest again. It's not just make them great again, it's make America the greatest again. I go through all of this so that we can fully appreciate what makes the seventh kingdom, in a way that's different to the fifth kingdom, to the papacy. In our next study, I want to spend some time comparing and contrasting the sixth and the seventh, so that when we get to identifying what the sins are of each of those kingdoms, we can put them in their right categories with knowing exactly what each represents and what each does to fulfill its job function or stops fulfilling its job function. So we'll stop here and have a little break and come back in a few minutes. So I'll close with a word of prayer. Dear God, as we consider the death and resurrection of this beast, of the King of the North, it's my prayer that we may come to grips with what that means politically for the great controversy and what that means for each of us as we consider our roles in the great controversy. I thank you for the opportunity to study together once again, and I praise you always. In Jesus' name, amen.